Schule hatten.
Jungle Book is a lasting gem in the Disney crown.
Have a banana.
It had a sense of perfection within itself.
As an animator, it's probably the greatest film in terms of character development and how characters play against one another.
Cool.
The animators poured their whole heart and soul into every scene in that movie.
I love the Jungle Book. I love it for its vitality, for its vivacity, for its sheer outrageousness.
Walt got something out of us that we didn't even know we had. Walt's holy grail was to make great pictures.
Walt, he put his fingers on the total theme of a picture in a story so quickly. It influenced me all the way to go for the simple story and strong characters.
You want to know something? We're good sparring partners.
I had no idea, I'm sure he didn't either, that this was going to be the last animated film he'd ever make. It just embodied so many of the beliefs and the feelings that Walt wanted to imbue to the people. He poured himself into every sequence.
Hey!
It would be impossible not to look at Jungle Book and say, yes, of course, you can see it's got Walt's fingerprints all over it.
I think Walt had that genius of being his own best audience, and then a genius in executing his vision of what this medium could do. He was inspiring a group of artists who'd never done it before.
Walt attracted strong personalities, great talents, and individualists like Bill Peet.
Bill Peet's one of the greatest story men that ever lived, someone who Walt had leaned on towards the end when his attention was being split by the parks and all of the things that Disney was getting into.
He had worked there since the 1930s, and he was really Walt's ace story man.
His fingerprints are all over all the Disney classics as a story man from pretty much Pinocchio on.
He had a sense of structure that was very helpful in an animated film.
Whenever there was a story problem, Walt would take it to Bill Peet.
I'm sorry, but I need your help. I was taking...
As Walt developed other interests in Disneyland and live-action pictures, Bill Peet's skill in developing animated story actually freed him up to do other things.
Bill Peet single-handedly storyboarded 101 Dalmatians.
It wasn't done that way. Disney never had one person do the screenplay.
When they delivered the script, Disney said, great, go make it. And he really kept his hands off that film through the story process.
So Disney allowed him to do Sword in the Stone, do the same thing with that. And then it was actually Bill Peet who proposed the Jungle Book to Walt Disney. He said we could do more interesting animal characters.
Once Walt gave Bill the okay to start adapting Jungle Book from Kipling, Pete took the film in his own direction, as he usually did.
He read and read and reread the Jungle Book, and he began to come up with story sketches. And he showed them to Walt, and Walt liked them.
I had spent a lot of time going upstairs to the 3rd floor to look at Bill Peet's storyboards. And I confess, the story that Bill was working on had me intrigued. I thought Bill was doing a fantastic job.
The Sword in the Stone, you know, that wasn't very well received.
Walt became a little bit more critical toward Bill Peet after Sword in the Stone.
He wanted to get much more involved in story than he had been in the previous couple, and he got all over Jungle Book.
There was also an additional problem. By the time that Walt headed in to the Jungle Book, he had reduced the whole animation operation so that there was a master animator who was the head of the entire operation, and that was Willie Reitherman. There was a single art director, Ken Anderson, and there were 4 supervising animators, Ollie Johnston, Frank Thomas, Milt Kahl, and John Lounsbury, all of whom were members of the famous 9 Old Men. And then there was 1 story man. And in the case of the Jungle Book, Bill Peet was really the story man. So it was Bill Peet's responsibility to devise the storyboards, to get the voices to be recorded, to record those voices. As Bill Peet himself once said, there were 40 people who were assigned to these jobs in the golden age of Disney animation. Now they were all being performed by 1 man, me, Bill Peet.
Bob and I had been staff writers at the studio for approximately 5 years by that time. And one day Walt called us in and said, "I don't like the way Jungle Book is going." Bill Peet had written a very sincere version of Rudyard Kipling's telling.
He saw a film taking shape that was initially not the kind of film that he wanted to see. It was very dark, it was very brooding, it wasn't the kind of film that he'd envisaged being made of Kipling's stories.
Walt and Bill couldn't seem to reach agreement on the film's development, and the two of them, after all those years, broke up. Pete left the studio and never returned.
After Bill Peet left, Larry Clements was given the job of putting together the story.
Well, when he put me on Jungle Book, that was my first writing on an animated cartoon feature.
Well, we were at this meeting, and the first thing Walt said, I remember, how many fellas have read the original Jungle Book story by Rudyard Kipling? And nobody said anything because nobody had read it. He says, "Good, I don't want you to read the book. Now here's the story." And with that, he launched into a typical Walt Disney storyteller. He's a master storyteller, the greatest storyteller you've ever seen. He characterized every personality with his face and his movements and his gestures. And he launched into how he wanted to tell the story. And he says, "But I want it to be fun. I want this to be a fun story, an adventure with fun, no mysterious, none of this heavy stuff." And that's what he looked at us and he said, "And I want to have a little heart in it too." You know what I mean?
We may look a bit shabby, but we've got hearts.
And feelings, too.
In those days, we developed the story visually. We worked from an outline, not conventional script pages, but from an outline by our writer, Larry Clements.
Walt didn't want to read things. He'd rather see storyboard sketches. It was visual, you could see it, you could see the action.
The whole idea of being a Disney story artist is that you're supposed to be able to take a bare bones outline and develop the character, add whatever entertainment value you can.
Walt liked people around him that were willing to try and dare, even though they didn't know quite where they were going or why even. But most of all, he stressed personality.
You better believe it, and I'm loaded with both.
When Walt Disney visited a project, he changed the project. And perhaps the most dramatic way in which he changed the project was with Phil Harris.
We went through a lot of bears before we got Phil, and none of them seemed to be right. And finally, Walt says, "Why don't you try Phil Harris?" And of course, some of the animators said, "Phil Harris in a Rudyard Kipling film?" And Walt says, "Why not? We're going to make our own Jungle Book, and we'll do it our way."
You better believe it.
Once Walt had heard the audition, Walt went bananas. He loved it. It was one of those things that kind of triggered things in Walt and got him excited.
Walt cared most about entertainment, and I think it shows in how the story was worked out.
We'd start with the main sequence in the middle of the picture, not the beginning, where all the main characters in it. We'd learn our characters, and then from there we'd expand either way.
Nice footage that flowed and was very entertaining, but we had no tiger in the picture yet.
The tiger? Sooner or later, Mowgli will meet Shere Khan.
I suggested to Walt in this meeting, "Don't you think this is a good time to just get an outline here so we know where we're heading?"
Walt said, "You guys don't worry about that icky, sticky story stuff. You leave that to me."
He wanted to get in closer on the characters. The story, the plot was of secondary importance to him. Jungle Book was very difficult for me to work on. I just never knew where I was or what was going on.
Nobody knew at that certain point how to finish the storyline, because the relationship between Baloo and the boy was so strong now that how could you possibly have Baloo acquiesce to letting the boy go into the man village?
And then they got to the end of the film and they didn't have an ending. So at one meeting, apparently Walt said, well, why not have the little girl from the village entice Mowgli? Ollie Johnston, who was supposed to animate that, was appalled. He thought that was a terrible ending.
Ollie was telling later on, and the more he thought about it, the way he would do it, the more he really got into it and found a really sensitive way of doing that. You know, it's very casual and, I don't want to say tasteful.
And that's the love story. It's a little tenderness, a little sweetness, and also the bittersweet idea of the fact that Baloo really wants the boy to come with him, but he and Bagheera go off together.
Kipling book is very dark and very mysterious and a terrific book. But I think Walt was very, very canny in wanting to go a completely different direction with it.
It's possibly, I think, the most bright and breezy, freewheeling, happy-go-lucky, upbeat of all Disney's movies.
It bears very little resemblance to the original Rudyard Kipling, but I don't think that's what Walt wanted. Walt always wanted things that had characters in them that engaged the audience, and I think this film delivers in spades that way.
Sometimes a storyline that's too complicated can get in the way, and Jungle Book had the simplest storyline ever.
I don't want to go back to the man village.
The storyline didn't get in the way of the characters, is the beauty of that little picture.
I want to be like you. I want can learn to be like someone like me. That.
Since this was the last film, the last feature that Walt was really involved with, I think his stamp is on the strength of the personalities. I think that's what really shines through more than anything else.
It's not the flashiest story they did. It's not the most grand artistically, but I don't think that there's ever been a better showcase for character animation.
One of the things Walt Disney always remarked over and over again in story meetings was, we've got some great characters here, we've got some great personalities. I want you guys to take advantage. And I recall Walt's words. He said, give me some good stuff.
A lot of putting personality into animated characters comes from the design, obviously. And they had Ken Anderson on the Jungle Book, who did these incredible first-pass sketches at the designs for these characters.
Ken Anderson started out as a trained architect, came to the studio in the 1930s, got some difficult assignments. There's the three little kittens. There's a scene where they're running through a room, and he animated this entire floor, turning in perspective. It's an enormously difficult assignment. Whenever they started on a project, they would go to Ken to come up with some ideas for character designs and props, settings.
Ken was just a master at coming up with a quick statement that read a certain kind of personality. There's a drawing that he did of Shere Khan where he just looks incredibly haughty and he's got this nose stuck up in the air and his chin sticking out.
Could it be possible that you don't know who I am?
Jungle Book came at a very interesting point in the evolution of animation at Disney. Walt, in some ways, knighted a group of artists all at the ultimate pinnacle of their career. Woolie Reitherman, who was also one of Walt's 9 old men, was the director. He was this very weathered pilot who was also an animator and then went into the service during World War II.
Woolie had been a transport pilot in the China, Burma, India theater. He'd seen action. He'd led a life of command as far as Walt was concerned.
I think the animators always respected me up to a point. Boy, you know, with the large talents that were there, it wasn't easy to get respect.
Woolie knew that he was dealing with people who knew that they were the best in what they did, and he had to deal with them.
They would work closely together with one another. Frank and Ollie certainly worked the closest, and then there was, I think, Milt maybe a little bit proving his own worth out there, and there was, I think, like a healthy competition sometimes between these animators.
Milt Kahl is all over this movie in every possible way, and he is really the animator's animator. His draftsmanship is brilliant. I've been through the Disney Animation Research Library looking for a bad Milt Kahl drawing, and I have yet to see one. They don't exist. I give up. The guy was flawless.
Milt Kahl was doing a lot of animation on all the characters to sort of set them up, and then it would pass it off to the other animators. Say, okay, this is it. Now go do it.
This is just a little example of how you can see how they work together. This is from a scene by Frank Thomas, and then it's pretty loose. Not all the details are worked out. So Frank asked Milt to help him out with it, and when you line them up, you can see how sensitively Milt really helped him with that upshot. And the anatomy overall made him a little wider. But I love doing this because
You can see the teamwork in something like this.
I'm talking about like a big bear.
And then there was John Lounsbury. John Lounsbury did the elephants. He had a great animator helping him, Eric Cleworth, who never gets a lot of credit, but Eric Cleworth also did some beautiful scenes with the elephants. But they were supervised by John Lounsbury.
John Lounsbury was a guy who could do fast action and dances like nobody's business. And in that wonderful King Louis scene, when Baloo disguises himself as a girl orangutan and the two of them do that dance, that tells you what Johnny Lounsbury was.
I think, in a way, the heart of the film rests on the work of two animators, which is Frank Thomas and Ollie Johnston, because together, Frank and Ollie, two best friends themselves, who'd worked with Disney for many years.
They animated roughly half the movie between the two of them over the course of a very short span of time.
Even their name is like one name, Frank and Ollie, and their offices were right next to each other. You would always see them in each other's office talking about an idea.
These drawings follow the section here where...
That looks good.
He's got
He's hopping up and down.
I said, keep it loose now. Keep it real loose.
It seemed like they developed this way of thinking that really went back all the way to when they started here at the studio.
The two of them met when they were 19 years old. And Frank had grown up in Fresno, which was pretty much a farming town at the time. And Ollie had grown up on the Stanford University campus, where his father was a professor there. But Frank's father was a college professor as well. So you had two young guys with more or less similar family backgrounds. They're both interested in art. They both came down to Los Angeles to go to art school. The next thing you know, there's an opportunity to take a tryout at Disney.
I put both Frank Thomas and Ollie Johnston in little cameos in both of my first two films.
Hey, you see that? Yeah, that's the way to do it. That's old school. Yeah? No school like the old school.
They're brilliant animators, both of them. You get the feeling that they were constantly kind of showing each other their stuff and getting the other's take on a scene.
Here were two guys who were involved with some of the most remarkable animated films that have ever been made.
I mean, you go back to Frank doing the ice skating scene in Bambi and the spaghetti eating scene in Lady and the Tramp.
Milt Cole mentioned to Ollie around the time that they were doing Sleeping Beauty, he said, you know, you and Frank have got something unusual, the way you can talk to each other about stuff.
They always trusted each other. I think that the feeling of trust is something that pervades the Jungle Book in terms of the character of Mowgli and Baloo.
In Jungle Book, I think the height of Frank's talent is when Baloo is trying to tell Mowgli that he's got to go back to the man village. It's a very difficult scene to pull off.
It's just, it touches on a million levels. He has to rise to the occasion of thinking about the notion of responsibility.
Subtext is so powerful. The bear knows he has to betray the kid, and the kid is completely unsuspecting.
What's the matter, old Papa Bear?
Look, Mowgli, I've been trying to tell you. I've been trying all morning to tell you. I've got to take you back to the man village.
Ollie's scenes were the fun part, where they did the song, The Bare Necessities.
I mean, bare necessities.
And Ollie's relationship of Baloo and the boy is full of fun and warmth and affection.
The Jungle Book, in some ways, boils down to kind of a buddy film. You know, there's this young boy and there's the bear, and in many ways that I think may have been a rich experience for those two guys because they were such good friends.
You can see how much they depend upon each other and the affection and fondness that there is, and you know that that's coming from the men that are animating them.
I think I'm most proud of the fact that between the two of us, we got that real warm friendship to come through. And that's what we wanted. We were both striving for that. And we both did practically all of the bear and Mowgli. And we felt would be the heart of the picture, and the warmth in a picture is what Walt always wanted us to get. And if there is anybody in the world who understands friendship, it's Frank and Ollie. Their friendship lasted for over 70 years.
When you look at Baloo and Mowgli, you're looking at Frank and Ollie, because those two guys were those characters. The love that the two men shared for each other is shared on the screen with those two characters.
I attended a lecture that Frank and Ollie gave for the Animators Union out here, and they ran a clip of Baloo introducing himself to Mowgli, and I remember thinking, wow, it's just a pile of drawings. It's just a pile of drawings, and look how full of life it is. It's utterly, thoroughly convincing. It has weight, it has personality, it has character.
Man, that's what I call a swinging party.
A really important thing about Jungle Book is the voice casting.
All of the voice talents are unique and superb and spot on, and they carry the story and they carry our affections.
This was probably the first time that Disney used people like Phil Harris and Louis Prima and George Sanders, who'd been on TV and in movies, very high profile, visible figures, as opposed to radio stars like earlier.
He did a little bit of that in Pinocchio.
Cricket's the name. Jiminy Cricket.
Hiring people who, at least as character actors, the audience would recognize. So when you get to something like The Jungle Book, I mean, it's kind of the farthest extension of this idea, because many of the voices, Phil Harris's voice, for example, is instantly recognizable.
Who, me? Sure I am.
George Sanders is pretty recognizable.
I say.
So here, the characters could be shaped around the voice.
Walt actually cast Phil Harris as Baloo because Walt knew him socially. Well, Phil Harris was married to Alice Faye, and they used to go to parties, and one day he said, I want him to be Baloo. And this was a shocking thing. How could Phil Harris, you know, a Dixieland jazz musician, you know, wisecracking guy, the sidekick of Jack Benny, how could he be a Kipling character?
Even Harris himself apparently, thought Walt was crazy. Like, what am I going to do? I don't do this.
So I got up and I started to read this thing, and I got about about 2 or 3 lines, and I looked over at Willie Wrightham, and I said, I can't do it. It just doesn't feel natural.
You know, it ain't easy learning to be like me.
They said, well, Phil, what do you suggest? I don't know what made me say it. I said, well, do you mind if I do it the way I would do it? And they said, go ahead and try it. I said, look, kid, you keep fooling around in here with these animals like that monkey will eat you. You get your roof knocked in. Ooh.
A lot of the things that are in the film are things that Harris came up with. No, the scriptwriters or the storymen did not come up with. Harris would have improvised this right on the stage.
And the animators suddenly had new life in the project. Ollie Johnson said to me that when Walt decided that Phil Harris was going to do the voice for Baloo, and they knew that they had a character that really worked, he said that was the turning point.
That is one of the greatest characters that Disney Animation has ever done. And everybody knows somebody like that guy. There are people who breeze through life and just kind of enjoy themselves.
I mean a doobie-doobie, doobie-doobie, doobie-dee-doo.
And sometimes this actor is so identified with his voice that you might actually physically want to put something of that into the character. I mean, actually caricature the actor a little bit into the character.
Ken Anderson used the visage of George Sanders for Shere Khan, and it really works wonderfully.
Bravo, bravo. An extraordinary performance.
And then Kaa, the snake, was Sterling Holloway, who was a veteran Disney voice.
Walt said, Sterling can do the snake, and he'll do a great job. Great, great voice. Who had done so many. He'd done Mr. Stork in Dumbo.
Which one of you ladies is expecting?
And the voice of Winnie the Pooh.
Oh, yes, I'm rumbly in my tumbly.
His voice is magical and very special.
Even before he was mentioned for Jungle Book, the animators would say, oh, no, not again, which was sort of the truth, but Walt said, why don't we try? I mean, I always believed in Walt. He had a good batting average. And it was such oblique casting to put him into this this villain's role, and that was one of the great things about Walt. A villain didn't always have to be mean. A villain could be devious in what he was trying to do, and yet be quite entertaining.
I have my own subtle little ways.
When you've got guys like Phil Harris, Baloo the Bear, Sterling Holloway as Ka the Snake, or Sebastian Cabot as Bagheera the Panther. I mean, these guys had tremendous personality that came right through the celluloid onto the screen.
The juxtaposition of Harris and Sebastian Cabot was very clearly defined the way the two of them acted it out. And Cabot was marvelous as Bagheera, as Harris was marvelous as Baloo.
I'd like to have a word with you. A word? You gonna talk some more?
You know, what's nice is Sebastian Cabot really kind of grounds it in that sort of real Kipling-esque world. And then, you know, they went off on a tangent and did some of these things like Louis Prima, which just, on paper, it just sounds like it wouldn't work. It's just like, where are you going with this, Walt? And then you see it, and it's just magic.
And old King Louis, that's me.
We had the sequence in pencil, and he came in one time. He was like a little kid. He'd wiggle his feet up and down and just slap and laughed all the way through it. He loved it.
Crazy.
I was fortunate enough to be asked to be a voice of one of the vultures.
Kid, we'd like to make you an honorary vulture.
It was, I have to admit, probably not my thespian prowess. It was probably that I was semi-famous and came from the north of England. They couldn't get the Beatles, so they had to settle for the B Squad.
So that's no big deal today about the Beatles. Then it was a really big deal. So it had a little extra for us when we watched it in the 60s. Today, that doesn't register, but the character does.
Haven't you got a mother or a father?
No.
I ended up getting cast as Mowgli as a result of having done the voice of Christopher Robin in the first Winnie the Pooh short, Winnie the Pooh and the Honey Tree.
There's only one thing we can do. Wait for you to get thin again.
As I was finishing that show, actually, Jungle Book began production, and they had cast another young boy in the role of Mowgli, who was a 11-year-old or something at the time. And of course, as production progressed, the poor kid's voice changed. And as a result, they had to bring in someone whose voice they could reliably predict would last for the next couple of years. And my voice was appropriate, and my dad was the director, and somehow that probably helped. And they ended up using me.
I'm all right. I'm a lot tougher than some people think.
They always tried to get child voices for the children in the films. It has a veracity that helps the believability of the fantasy.
Stick your nose out. Like this? That's right.
The highlight of it all for me was I was in the middle of the session, and out of the corner of my eye, I look and I see a shadow of a figure that looks an awful lot like Walt Disney. And a few seconds later, the door opens and Mr. Disney steps into the room. And he waves at me and he says, "Hi, Clint." The memory of Walt Disney coming in and saying hi is something I'll never forget.
When I grow up, I'm going to be a colonel.
Well, the great thing about the Jungle Book is the casting of the characters involved, that the voices are all strong personalities. They're voices that just have a tremendous physical presence. At its heart, it's more fun than virtually any other Disney film I can think of.
Oh, man. Look for the bare necessities, the simple bare necessities.
The songs in the Jungle Book by the Sherman Brothers and Bare Necessity, of course, by Harry Gilkinson, they're some of the best, most memorable songs. It's one of the great soundtracks of Disney animation. And the beauty of it is that the songs work their way in and out of the story so seamlessly. They don't really start like, Broadway songs tend to, and they don't really finish the way you expect a big, applause button kind of song to finish.
Yeah. Well, man, what a beat.
I feel like that's a particular kind of art that's not always observed. There's a tendency to make songs first and then throw some lyrics that address the story, but not so much a thought to what kind of a song is this, and what is the psychology of the song.
Bob and I both felt very strongly the story is the most important thing in any project. Not the song as a song, but the song as development. And because we thought that way, we thought really in the way Walt felt about things, too.
Walt had a great deal of respect for the Sherman Brothers. He did bring them in to story meetings on occasion because he wanted them to really get into the picture.
He said, I hate singing heads, you know, two people singing at each other. He hated that. What he wanted to have is something happening at all times.
The idea was not to stop the story, but to progress the story. Look for the spots in the action where they come naturally.
1, 2, 3, 4, keep it up. 2, 3, 4.
I think the Sherman Brothers had a special relationship with Walt. I mean, Walt often referred to them as his sons, and even on days when he might be a little down in the dumps, he would often go see the Sherman Brothers and have them play and sing a song to lift his spirits.
And the songs were written by Terry Gilkyson, and they were much darker, more sinister, more heavy than Disney really wanted to see. So who did he turn to? Well, he turned to the Sherman Brothers. He turned to his boys.
One day Walt said, I'd like you to come in and create some music to tell the story in a lighter way.
Walt didn't think it was much fun, and so he had us write Disney-type, humorous things.
And so basically, the original version was discarded.
Terry Gilkyson, I do know that Walt wanted all of his songs cut from the film. Well, there was one song that everybody just loved and said, oh man, Walt, you can't cut that song. This is a great song. And so they begged and they pleaded with Disney to leave one song in the film, and that was The Bare Necessities, which is the only Gilkyson song that remains in the score.
Look for the bare necessities, the simple bare necessities. Forget about your worries and your strife. I mean the bare necessities. That's why a bear can rest at ease with just the bare necessities of life.
Because then the Sherman Brothers came in and did the rest. They were wonderful collaborators. They sprang personalities out of our music. They did Colonel Hathey's March.
Here's a military goal.
Up, 2, 3, 4, keep it up. 2, 3, 4. That's right out of my military experience and my brother's, because Bob was in the service and so was I. It was J. Pat O'Malley was Colonel Hathey. Oh, yes, I remember the days.
I've told you once, I've told you 1,000 times.
Pop, look out!
Oh. We have this wonderful little bit of business where Kaa is trying to hypnotize Mowgli.
Let me look at you.
When we first showed him the sequence at one of our earlier meetings, Walt liked it, but he said, I think we could use a song here. The Sherman Brothers were able to jump in, turn around a new song for us in a week's time.
Bob and I had written a lot of songs for Mary Poppins. We'd written a mysterious melody for a place called the Land of Sand, and it went like this. Here in the land of sand, nothing is what it seems. If that melody sounds familiar, it was not used in Mary Poppins. One day we said, let's write a mysterious tune for Kaa the Snake. So we said, let's use that tune. And we wrote, Trust in me.
Just in me. Shut your eyes.
The animators, I think, grabbed on to the easygoing, sleepy quality of that song. It's inventive and playful and fun to watch, but you know, it's also got this sinister aspect that's just great.
Toward the climax of the film, Mowgli has this encounter with vultures who, if you'll notice, they happen to sound a lot like a popular singing group of the time.
Blimey, he's got legs like a stork, he has.
You know, they all have Liverpool accents, you know, and The whole idea was that they were going to eventually break into a song to cheer the kid up. The song entitled We're Your Friends was going to be sung to a rock beat.
When you're done in, who winds around to pluck you up when you are down.
Halfway through the animation, word came down from High that Walt had cold feet on the idea, and he said that it's going to date it. So we had to go back and redo the song. So what they did, they changed it to a barbershop quartet.
We're your friends. We're your friends to the bitter end.
And it was just an inside joke with us, but everybody seemed to dig it. And it was a fun thing. It was a barbershop quartet, but done as if the Beatles had sung it.
And when you're lost, in dire need, who's at your side at lightning speed?
We did 5 songs for Jungle Book, but my favorite, it's got to be I Want to Be Like You. I just love that.
We figured that Louis Prima would be the ideal character. And so we went to Las Vegas, played the song for Louis and the boys. They loved it.
So we had Louis Prima, Sam Butera and the Witnesses, and then Phil Harris comes in and he does his business. It was just special.
Well, I recall the day Prima and his band came to the Disney studio to record that wonderful King Louis song, I Want to Be Like You. We had our own recording stages. And so Prima's band was there, and it was just a little too wild and crazy for Disney. But boy, we heard those tracks, and they just knocked us out. Prima recorded the stuff by himself because Phil Harris wasn't able to make that session.
Sam Butera did the voice of that Baloo was going to do, and Louis Prima had the spot where he goes Scooby-Dooby-Doo. He did that little spot there where he goes Scooby-Dooby-Doo, and then Sam Butera would say Scooby-Dooby-Doo, a-dee-ba-da-ba-da, a-dee-ba-da-ba-da, a-do-ba-do-ba-do. It was just aping back and forth. And when Phil Harris heard this temporary recording, he said, I don't sing like that. That's none of my words. I don't that kind of. So he was getting excited. He said, well, just let me hear Louis, and I'll do my answers. So you heard Scooby-Dooby-Doo, Arif, Anaza, Ebba-dabba-doy,
Willa-la-ba-zini, Waddle-a-but-woodle-a-but, Sibla-a-dore, Willa-ha-ha.
It was amazing. And that spontaneity came off onto the soundtrack, came off onto the screen, and it was just an amazing sequence.
But that crazy and wild sequence was more Vegas than Burbank, and it got toned way down by our composer, George Bruns, who scored the film.
George Bruns was a wonderful musician. He did many films at Disney, and he wrote Davy Crockett, the song, Davy Crockett. And he was a terrific guy. He took our songs and made them work for the film so beautifully and interpreted them. It's not just writing a song, it's making the song work in background music and everything. He did a fabulous job with it.
I think George Bruns is kind of underrated. I think that there's a lot of really charming music in Jungle Book, and I think even the opening music sets the tone in a nice way.
When we wrote the song for the little girl to sing at the end of the film, it was woven in throughout the picture, so that by the time you hear it, it's like a reprise almost. But the tune was the main theme of the show. And that theme, actually, George wove throughout the film. So you always had the feeling this is where it's going to be heading. So by the time you hear the song, you sort of feel completed. You see, anybody can sit down and just plunk out a tune and write some verses and rhyme Moon and June and have a song. I mean, that's that. But to write a song that works for a film, it has to be of the film.
Till I'm grown, till I'm grown.
Richard and I always help tell the story through the songs. Walt liked that.
I think one of the reasons why we got along so well with the boss was the fact that he knew that we didn't care about anything but the story. if we could make the story develop and push forward, he was very happy. Everyone respected him tremendously. He was so intuitive and correct usually. But more than that, he respected what we felt too. Nobody at the studio was aware that Walt was as sick as he was.
He'd had a neck pain, and he went in to have that examined because he suspected it might be a pinched nerve.
We knew that he was going into the hospital, and we thought it was about an old polo injury he'd had in his neck. And so we asked him if he was worried about it, and he says, "You're darn right I am."
When diagnostic tests were done, they discovered that he had lung cancer.
Walt was like a father figure to everybody. You just don't think father's ever going to get sick or ever certainly going to die.
In between that period of November and December 15th, he kind of summoned his strength and came back to pay that one last visit to the studio.
Everybody was kind of perked up. Gee, Walt's feeling better, you know, that's good.
I was so grateful and glad to see him. I said, "Gee, it's good to see you, Walt." He said, "Ken, it's sure good to be here."
He was very thin and gaunt and grayed. I realized he's much sicker than I imagined.
He came into my office and sat down. He just wanted to talk. Matter of fact, in that chair in there, as a matter of fact. And then he walked down the hall and said goodbye. He never said goodbye to anybody in his life. Well, I'll see you next week or something.
And then he asked to be driven home because he no longer had the energy.
And that was the last anybody ever saw. Then it wasn't more than another week that we came to work, and about 9:30, I remember it so clearly, Ollie came in with tears in his eyes and he says, "Walt's dead."
People dealt with it in their own way. Some were in tears, some just packed up their stuff and went home. Others just sat at their desks silently.
All the animators were coming in. Milt and Frank, they were devastated. What are we going to do?
I believe that Walt never ever gave it a thought that what if it happened to this wonderful thing if I passed on. I don't think he ever thought of that.
In some ways, Walt's death forced each one of them to become the mature animators that they were by that point. The mantle of animation was really placed on their shoulders.
There was an afternoon late in the course of Walt's illness when his end was imminent that he called my dad over to the hospital and explained to him that he wanted my dad to take over as the person who would take the full-length feature animated programs forward at the studio.
Willie forged ahead and got the picture going, and everybody was behind him 100%.
This was survival as far as I was concerned, and most of the animators were concerned. It was survival to keep this thing going, this thing called Walt Disney Animation.
That was a good feeling, knowing that his last film would be completed the way Walt wanted it completed.
In February, we ran the picture, and a large group of the studio people were in to see the film. And Hazel George, the nurse, talked to me afterwards.
Walt's nurse was very close to Walt because Walt had an injury and he needed massages regularly after a long day and all that, so she usually knew what was going on in Walt's mind.
She had this way of talking about Walt. She said, Walt wasn't a man, he was a force of nature. In that last scene where Baloo and Bagheera dance off into the sunset, she says, you know, that's just the way Walt went off. He went off into the sunset. Just like that, and there he's gone.
I think that's a way of saying, and life goes on, and I think that's a very nice way of capping Walt's career as well.
It's like a coda to his career. It conveys the qualities that he is best remembered for, the personalities of the characters, the warmth of them, the believability of the fantasy.
And then that magical thing, a year later, in 1967, almost a year after his death, The Jungle Book was released. A new Disney film.
And it was kind of like Walt Disney's time-released posthumous Christmas gift to the kids of the world.
It was a big darn deal, and it was very popular.
Jungle Book was the first picture to make a lot of money. Everybody was so proud. This picture gave the company confidence in animation, which may have or may not have been wavering at the time.
Both Louis Prima and Phil Harris, with all the things that they've done in their careers, they both were quoted as saying, the one thing that gives me immortality will be the Walt Disney picture, Jungle Book.
La la la
Unfortunately, there wasn't a way for Bill Peet and Walt to mend their ways before Walt passed away. But when Bill Peet wrote his autobiography some 20 years later, he had a lot of great and kind things to say about Walt.
The key to any Disney animated film has to be the heart. In that period of time, in the making of Jungle Book, Walt was driving it home to those guys. This is why we're doing what we do.
Jungle Book is a distillation of a long, rich friendship between Frank and Ollie, of a loving relationship between Wooly and his son Bruce. It's a distillation of the relationships of people in that studio, the lives they'd lived, the emotions they'd felt, and they found a vehicle that they could really express all these things through.
To me, it's very poetic that here at the end of his life, the last picture he worked on, it sort of came full circle of the fun that he had way back in the 30s working on the shorts with the guys he had there. It may even have been the last story meeting that he had with the animators. He said to them, "Gee guys, I had forgotten how much fun this is."
Look for the bare necessities, the simple bare necessities. Forget about your worries and your strife. I mean the bare necessities, or Mother Nature's recipes that bring the bare necessities of life.
Many strange legends are told of these jungles of India, but none so strange as the story of a small boy named Mowgli.
When Walt Disney acquired the rights to Rudyard Kipling's The Jungle Book, he undertook a monumental challenge in storytelling. Kipling's The Jungle Book was a sprawling series of stories about the wild child Mowgli, his life among the animals, his conflicts with Shere Khan, and his struggles to adapt to civilization. As he had done in the past with his animated classics from Snow White and the Seven Dwarfs to Sleeping Beauty, Walt Disney devised an ingenious narrative approach to a literary masterpiece to mold it to his unique style of animated storytelling. A style so successful that to this day, when we think of those classic stories, most people remember the Disney versions. First among the challenges was to create a linear story from Kipling's episodic adventures that jump forward and back in time. Disney's top storyman, Bill Peet, worked on the adaptation for over a year. When Peet left the studio after arguing with Walt over his approach to the story, he brought home photostats of the story sketches he had begun for his version of The Jungle Book. Now, with Peet's April 1963 treatment from the studio's archives and the recent rediscovery of Peet's photostats more than 40 years later in Bill Peet's home studio, we can see how the story evolved from Rudyard Kipling's original Mowgli stories to Bill Peet's unfinished version to Walt Disney's animated classic.
It all began when the silence of the jungle was broken by an unfamiliar sound.
The story's opening sequence, the discovery of Mowgli and his rescue by the wolves, exemplifies the different approaches of Kipling, Peet, and Disney. In Kipling, the wolves hear Shere Khan attacking a camp of woodcutters. The woodcutter's child wanders off and enters the wolves' cave. Mother Wolf protects Mowgli when Shere Khan comes to claim him. Bill Peet, wanting to add drama and suspense to Kipling's story, embellished the rescue of Mowgli. A man cub has been carried off by the river, clinging to a log. The wolves gather at the waterfall to watch the baby go over the edge. Bagheera tries to rescue the baby but fails. Mother Wolf saves the cub's life as he goes over the waterfall. Disney simplified this story's opening to a few elegant visuals, suggesting the flood by the image of the wrecked canoe. Throughout his adaptation, Bill Peet added dramatic details to Kipling's story. When Walt Disney took over the project, he simplified the narrative every step of the way to make room for character and entertainment.
What's the
matter, old Papa Bear?
Look, Mowgli, I've been trying to tell you. I've been trying all morning to tell you. I've got to take you back to the Man Village.
The Man Village?
Bill Pete's greatest departure from Kipling's The Jungle Book turned out to provide the foundation for Disney's story. The Odyssey from the jungle back to the Man Village. That was the anchor that Walt and his story team kept returning to when they encountered difficulties. Kipling's Mowgli went back and forth between the jungle and the village, but the actual journey from jungle to civilization was a complete invention of Bill Pete and Walt Disney. The most complete sequence of Bill Pete's storyboards shows how Pete and later Disney used the journey to introduce characters. From Bill Pete's own treatment and storyboards.
An early morning mist hangs over the jungle, and Mowgli and Bagheera are still asleep. Suddenly, there's a violent shaking of the tree. Down below, an elephant herd is crowded about the tree, and a great bull bellows, "Man cub, what are you doing in my jungle?" And with his huge head, gives the tree trunk another violent butt. "Hold on, Hathi," cries Bagheera. "Now don't worry about the man cub. He's on his way back to his village." As the great elephant starts away, he warns, "I'm no killer, man cub, but if I ever come across you in my jungle again, I'll be forced to it." Man and his red flower. "A close one indeed," exclaims Bagheera. "Now let's get moving before our luck runs out." And he leaps from the tree limb to land lightly on the ground. And as the boy scrambles down to join him, Bagheera takes a cautious look around before starting off. Suddenly, a rhino comes crashing through the bush straight for Mowgli. "I smell a man cub," he bellows. "Death to the man cub!" The rhino wheels around in a fury, his tiny red eyes darting about in confusion. "I'll find you, man cub, wherever you are!" And Mowgli and Bagheera climb a ladder of stout, snaky vines until they are perched safely out of reach on a limb, while the nearsighted rhino goes blundering about far below, charging at bushes, stumps, and boulders in hopes one might be the man cub. Mowgli shakes with laughter, but Bagheera, as usual, remains sternly serious. "If you think this is funny," he growls, "you'll find many more laughs in this jungle. Have you ever tried laughing inside a python?" The boy looks at the thick, ropey vine upon which he is sitting. It is a giant python, and while they've been talking, the big snake has quietly arranged a few of his large coils around the boy until he is wrapped like a mummy.
Bill Pete's Colonel Hathi and Kaa were the starting points for Disney's more richly personified characters.
Those were the days. Discipline was a thing. Bill's character, all that sort of thing, you know.
Pete's Rhino evolved in Disney's hands to a character named Rocky the Rhino, a punch-drunk fighter who showed up in storyboards of the Vultures sequence before being dropped from the story. Another element that Pete adapted from Kipling is the danger posed to the jungle by man's red flower, fire. In Kipling, fire is mentioned in the first scenes as the thing that animals fear and hate most about man. In Pete's story, Mowgli asks Bagheera about the red flower. In Pete's own words,
"Red flower in man talk is fire," replies Bagheera. "Fire?" puzzles Mowgli. Bagheera stops to stare at a charred black spire rising out of the ferns. That was once a great mango tree, devoured by the red flower. Many years ago, the jungle creatures attacked man's village, destroyed his cane fields and cattle. Then man, in his anger, turned loose the red flower and destroyed the jungle and many of the beasts.
Later in Pete's story, Mowgli steals fire from the man village to challenge Shere Khan. In story meetings, Walt told his story team to steer clear of what he called the icky, sticky story stuff. Long dialogue-heavy scenes were not for his vision of the Jungle Book. In his ongoing emphasis on entertainment and comedy, the only touches Walt left of Kipling's Red Flower are with King Louie,
laid a secret on me of man's red fire,
and in the final defeat of Shere Khan. The character of Baloo is another big departure from Kipling's story. Kipling describes Baloo as a sleepy, serious old brown bear, a noble teacher of the law of the jungle, who teaches Mowgli the secret words of all the animals so he is safe wherever he goes. Pete's Baloo laid the foundation for Disney's Baloo, a lazy, happy-go-lucky bear who gains a sense of responsibility through his love for Mowgli.
Doo-be-doo, doo-be-doo, doo. Why, you flat-nosed, little-eyed, flaky creep!
All three versions of the story feature the spectacular sequence of Mowgli's kidnapping by the Bandarlog, the monkey people. In Kipling, the ruined city of the monkeys is a frightening place. The monkeys roam the ruins, pretending to be men. They are people without a law. They want Mowgli to teach them how to weave sticks together to make shelter. Bill Peet tried to retain the mysterious qualities of Kipling's Bandarlog. They want Mowgli to show them how to rebuild the city and teach them the secret of fire. Pete introduced slapstick comedy into the sequence with the rescue of Mowgli by Baloo and Bagheera. Disney steered the entire episode toward personality and entertainment. King Louie, with Louis Prima's voice, evolves into a wonderfully comic character.
Now I'm the king of the swingers, oh, the jungle VIP.
Striving for a more richly developed story, Pete spun off from the idea of Kipling's The Second Jungle Book, a hidden treasure under the city. In Pete's version, the King of the Apes shows Mowgli the treasure he keeps under the palace. Mowgli has no interest in riches, but later in the story, a hunter from the man village forces Mowgli to lead him to the treasure. In both Kipling's and Pete's versions of the story, Mowgli returns to the man village and is reunited with the woman, Nathu, who may be his long-lost mother. He stays in the village for 3 months, learning the ways of man. In Kipling, a character from the village, a hunter named Buldeo, thinks Mowgli is a sorcerer or a man-wolf from the jungle and stirs up the villagers against him. Mowgli kills Shere Khan with the help of his brother wolves. He returns to the Wolf Council, but he is not allowed to stay. The story ends with Mowgli and his wolf brothers going off to hunt on their own. Bill Peet, having set up the treasure under Monkey City, was determined to weave that element into a dramatic climax. In his story, Mowgli leaves the village to return to the jungle. His new enemy, Buldeo the Hunter, follows and forces him to lead him to the treasure. Mowgli distracts Buldeo as Shere Khan attacks, killing the hunter. Mowgli uses the hunter's rifle to kill Shere Khan. In the end, Mowgli is a hero among both humans and animals. He lives in the village, but is free to come and go as he pleases in the jungle. This entire sequence was dropped from Disney's version. Walt Disney felt that the heart of this story was Baloo's responsibility to see that Mowgli gets back to the man village, and that their arrival to the village was the natural ending for the film. Walt's biggest question was, what draws Mowgli to the village after he spent the whole story trying to stay in the jungle?
Nothing or nobody is ever gonna come between us again.
When Bill Peet left the project, Disney had urged his story team to ignore Kipling's The Jungle Book and to concentrate on entertainment and personality. But in story meetings, when they were stuck for the ending, Walt kept browsing the book for ideas. He found inspiration in 2 passages, one from the end of Mowgli's stories in The Jungle Book. Years afterward, he became a man and married. And one from Kipling's The Second Jungle Book. A girl in a white cloth came down some path that led from the outskirts of the village. Mowgli parted the stalks with his hands and watched her until she was out of sight. And from those passages came the ending Walt had been searching for.
Till the day that I am grown.
Despite the falling out between Walt and Bill Peet, it's interesting to see how much the final version of Disney's The Jungle Book owes to the original work done by Peet.
Thank you for detaining my victim.
Disney simplified the story to the bare necessities. An odyssey home again. An odyssey through dangers and temptations, friendships and growing up. As he expressed in story meetings, fewer events equals more room for character.
Look for the bare necessities, the simple bare necessities.
The enduring appeal of The Jungle Book is a testament to Walt Disney's understanding of his audience and his faith in his own vision. As he had proven with all his animated classics since Snow White and the Seven Dwarfs, Walt Disney had a profound ability to take literary classics and make them uniquely his own. With Kipling's The Jungle Book, he took a story that dramatized the differences between man and animals in a world where man is the danger, and transformed it into a delightfully entertaining musical adventure about the similarities between man and animals and the brotherhood of all living creatures.
I still think he'd have made one swell bear. Ha ha! What have we here?
Well, The Jungle Book was my first Disney film. The very first one, so of course that leaves a huge impression on you.
Andres Deja and I have always had this rivalry to see who's the biggest Jungle Book fan, and we're still trying to settle that one. You know, it may come down to a cage match or something.
It did inspire me to become an animator. If you like to draw, the way I see it, there's no higher accomplishment than to go into animation and make those drawings come alive.
By the age of 11, in fact, it was on Jungle Book, something clicked in me and I realized that this was somebody's job, and their job was not only to do these drawings but to give these characters individuality.
How interesting.
That made becoming an adult suddenly sound much more attractive because there was, you know, there were cool things to be done.
Today's animators grew up, you know, with that picture. We're influenced by the warmth of the personalities.
You know something? You're all right, kid.
And I think it's resonated with a whole generation of current animators and has influenced their work.
For anybody who has gone into personality animation, to see the relationship between Mowgli and Baloo, and to see the acting of those two characters, it's truly inspirational.
You want to know something? We're good sparring partners.
You'd better believe it.
And if you were to see that when you were a young person, I think you would be hooked for good.
I've always thought of Jungle Book as really the entry into Disney animation for me personally.
I have the biggest collection of rough animation drawings from The Jungle Book. I think I do. I was about 11 years old and I had little pocket money. So me and a school friend went into the next town and saw The Jungle Book, and my life changed.
The first time I saw Jungle Book, it was in an open theater in the summertime. Halfway through the movie, it starts pouring. And I wouldn't move, I wouldn't budge. I actually sat through the whole movie and I was soaking wet through the end of it. It was just sheer amazement.
I went to see it probably half a dozen times. I tried to make flip books of it. You know, basically I was completely smitten. It was a huge hit, and this was as big in Europe as it was in the States.
You better believe it.
I first saw Jungle Book when I was about 11, growing up in England. It came out as a re-release. It was quite a revelation, I think, at that time for me.
I couldn't believe that people could learn to draw to such point that they could make things like this believable.
The Jungle Book's really an animator's movie. think that's why so many animators gravitate to it, because it really boasts possibly the best character animation the studio ever did. When King Louis is dancing around, you know, the weight you get on his body really feels like an orangutan's body. And yet he's caricatured and he's still his own personality. I was just amazed at the type of life they could get in the characters. They were just bursting with it.
Yeah. Well, man, what a beat.
The thing that really attracted me was just the magic trick of being able to imbue what were obviously drawings, like real sort of weight and muscles, but only defined in like a few lines. And it was just such a like, how do you do that? How do you make just like a single line that's describing the back of a panther, describe everything about that panther?
Stop! Wait a minute. Halt! I just remember being absolutely delighted by John Lounsbury's animation of these elephants, Colonel Hathi, and just he's marching along, and it's just like, wow, such weight and power and strength to these characters.
And remember, an elephant never forgets. What the army's coming to these days.
When I got to the studio, I met John Lounsbury. He had these great, thick pencils that he was drawing with that I ended up buying all the rest that there were of that pencil, and that became the pencil for me to animate my characters.
John Lounsbury is a particularly important influence for me because when I was assigned to do Tantor the Elephant in Tarzan, you couldn't help but thinking immediately, well, how am I gonna do a better job or even just close of being that good as they did on Jungle Book?
Discipline. Discipline was the thing. Builds character. All that sort of thing, you know.
Frank Thomas and Ollie Johnston worked very close together, you know, for their whole careers.
Frank and Ollie animated about 50% of the movie.
Hey, kid, you need help. And old Baloo's gonna learn you to fight like a bear.
The animation on Baloo is probably Frank Thomas's finest.
I checked out of the archives the drawings of Ollie Johnston's of the little girl at the end, and there was this simple elegance to his drawing that I went back and looked at again when I was designing Ariel and the Little Mermaid. I don't know. It's the high watermark of design and character really blended well together. I don't know that we've ever done better than that.
It's influenced me in every character I've ever done. I mean, just the level of understanding of how to portray a character, how to make it appealing.
Yeah. It's beautiful, ain't it?
Then there was Milt Kahl's incredible design.
Milt, you know, primarily did everything on Shere Khan, all that phenomenal stuff with Ka.
Shere Khan. What a surprise.
Yes, isn't it?
I remember doing the scene of Scar walking around Simba. I remember going and getting as many of those Shere Khan walks from the research library and flipping through them and trying to figure it out. And I animated Rafiki mainly in The Lion King. I had original roughs of Milt Kahl's of King Louis right there on my board.
Crazy.
Anyone that worked on Lion King literally went to Jungle Book and go, well, this is how good it can be.
There's a scene where Mowgli is walking along, hopping down from one branch to the next, and there was such a natural ease the way this boy moved. And I remember for Aladdin, I had to do a scene where Aladdin is walking up the steps and trying to get that in the Aladdin animation.
And Mowgli is just so beautifully drawn, and he moves like a real kid. That probably influenced me when I did Lilo and Lilo and Stitch. I wanted to be really truthful to the anatomy and the drawing of a real girl.
Jungle Book animation really kind of became the standard in any animation I do. Always try to make it fun. You You know, I did the parrot character in Aladdin, and I tried to make him kind of shaggy and falling apart, kind of like the vultures. Whenever they scratch themselves, their feathers are flying off.
I think the most direct influence I've gotten from the movie is appreciating its technique. I've studied lots of it frame for frame, just to see how they got certain things.
There's nothing spontaneous about the medium of animation. Animation is, by its very nature, is a slow, kind of thoughtful medium where you analyze something and then you perfect things. But Jungle Book feels kind of spontaneous. There's a looseness to the performances and a lightness to them. And that is something that I've tried to have in my work.
Can't help by being completely drawn to the work that these guys did. It's really about giving characters soul, and that's what Jungle Book did so well. That was so inspiring.
I wanna be like you.
I wanna walk like you, talk like you.
It's more difficult to do the human characters because everyone has seen a pretty girl, a boy, an old man. They know what people look like. But not many people have seen a singing and dancing lion or a bear that talks, so you have a lot more latitude with them.
In order to caricature the real thing, Walt Disney always said you have to know what the real thing looks like. So before we draw something, if it's an animal, we try to learn what he looks like. Now in Jungle Book, we were going to do a sequence of the bear scratching. And so we studied some live action that we had of the bear. We were really loving this and enjoying this sensual pleasure, and studied it very carefully. We didn't use it per se, but we did get a lot out of it, and how the bear would move, what his proportions were, and a little bit about how he felt while he was doing this, because they loved to scratch.
Now, with Mowgli here, he is essentially a human, and he's behaving like a human. He's moving like a human, and we have to be very careful how we handle him. It's much more difficult to draw these actions. The expression always begins with the eyes. Walt always told us the audience watches the eyes, and you better watch them too. The eyes really reveal more than any part of the rest of the face what the character is thinking. Now, in the case of Shere Khan, he's very cool, very confident. He doesn't have to open his eyes wide. But poor Ka over here has quite a problem, and he's worried, he's concerned, he's trying hard to come up with some kind of an alibi or an excuse. It gives the animator a wide latitude of expressions. We had even additional problems with the snake because he has no shoulders and no hands, and we had an action here where he was going to cover his mouth with his hands. Now, what do? He had said something he didn't mean to say, and he's very embarrassed about it. By using part of his body, we were able to get the attitude we wanted. I got the bear coming in here. This is a scene where he's teaching Mowgli how to box, you know.
Oh, yeah, that's where he runs around the side.
Yeah, the boy's over in this part. Actually, these drawings follow the section here where, see the boys there in the background.
Yeah. Oh, that looks good.
He's got this action.
He's hopping up and down.
I said, keep it loose now. Be real loose.
Wiggling his fanny. Yeah, that looks good. Stages well. I like it.
All in all, from the start of the story work till the picture is completed, takes about 4 years. But even so, the thing that the animator is thinking about is that his drawings are going to be up there forever. Any mistakes you make that you sort of say, well, I had a bad day, they're going to come back and haunt you. But more than that, as you work on a character, you develop the character, you begin to feel like a parent. And you work so hard to make him come to life up there on the screen. You feel like it's someone you know very well. And you have to enjoy working with them. And when the picture's over, there's always a sad moment as you finish your last scene because you know that's the last time you're ever going to see that particular character. He may live in your mind from then on, but you'll never really be working with him in a creative sense.